All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to Praxis 313. So last session, you will recall, we were reading the Invisible Committee's manifesto, now, maintenant, which talked about destituent power, about destitution of institutions and organizations, and destitution of government structures, of rendering ourselves ungovernable, of secession, of creating communes, of withdrawing from contemporary politics. One could hardly think of a more radically different text today. From destitution to constitution, perhaps, to constituent power, right? The U.S. must guarantee health care for every man, woman, and child through a national Medicare for all single-payer system, page 81, and dental care for everyone, page 96. Free universal higher education, page 105. Ending private prisons, 165. Ending the death penalty, 166. Demilitarize police forces. Federally funded body cameras for all law enforcement officers. Legalize marijuana. Ban the box. The DREAM Act, DACA, Path to Citizenship for 11 million undocumented people. Reverse climate change, stick with the Paris Accord, that's page 147. Ban fracking, tax carbon and methane pollution, a tax on stock sales that's going to stop high-frequency speculative trading, and fund $300 billion of free higher education for everyone in this country. A federal minimum wage that's a living wage, and more and more and more. A progressive estate tax, paid vacations, paid sick leave, most importantly, paid maternity leave. In this country, there's no paid maternity leave. It's absolutely crazy. A major federal jobs programs that puts millions of Americans to work at decent paying jobs, equal pay for men and women, and on and on. The platform could be considered pretty radical, but maybe it's not radical enough. How do we think about it from a kind of critical theory perspective? Is it even important to think about it from a critical theory perspective? What might that help us see or not see? Or do we just kind of pull the plug on critical theory in this session and just go back to what? Politics? There's no question here that there's no question here of ideology, I don't think. I don't think that there's an issue here of trying to lift the veil from our eyes. According to Bernie Sanders, we all know this stuff. We all understand it, right? It's there, it's obvious. The only problem is we're not doing anything about it, right? But it's not a question of a critical theoretic intervention to kind of reveal something to us that we can't see. The only thing that we can't see, perhaps, is that we're not actually doing enough about it, perhaps. Clayton Reinhold, one of our graduate students in class, just posted an interesting intervention where he argues that really, actually, maybe it's flipping critical theory on its head here. The problem is not that we don't see this. The problem is that actually we all see it, we're just not doing anything about it, right? In a kind of more contemporary kind of surface reading interpretation or a surface reading approach, right, is one where in English departments now, and criticism now, it's like, it's there, it's on the page, right? The only issue is doing something about it. All right. Well, so how do we approach this from the perspective of critical theory or not? To help us try and decipher these fascinating texts, and I have to say, I'm expecting an extraordinary conversation tonight. Maybe, you know, of course, you're never supposed to kind of anticipate because then it's always going to be deceiving. But the idea of reading these texts from a critical theoretic perspective, I think, is a real challenge and is truly an opportunity for self-reflection, I think. And we're really fortunate to have three brilliant critical thinkers with us here today. First, Amna Akbar, who I'm delighted to have with us. She's coming down from Princeton University, where she's a Lapa Fellow this year. She's a brilliant scholar of the punitive state. She mostly writes in the area at the intersections of kind of penal law and national security, has authored a number of extraordinary texts, including National Security's Broken Windows, and more recently Towards a Radical Imagination of Law, which is in the New York Law Review, and which we point to on the website so that you can get a sense of her interventions. And she has a terrific post on the site as well, so I encourage you to reread that and come back to it. And we're going to start with her. After her, we're delighted to welcome back Brandon Terry, who has been with us for a few of these series. Last was the Counter-Revolution on Uprising 1313 at Riverside Church. So Brandon comes down to us from Harvard, where he's a professor of African and African-American studies and social studies, and a brilliant political theorist and critical theorist, and he's the editor of the recent collection To Shape a World, Essays on the Political Philosophy of Martin Luther King, and the author of a forthcoming book, still called, I think, The Tragic Vision of the Civil Rights Movement, which will be a signature contribution. Thanks, Brandon, for joining us. And then after Brandon, I'm delighted to welcome our own Adam Tooze back to the table. Adam is the Shelby Cullum Davis Chair in History here at Columbia University and the director of the European Institute, and the author most recently, you must all know, of a magisterial tome that is worth its weight in intellectual contributions and in pages, called Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World, out with Penguin Random House a month ago, a few months ago, just a few, yeah. So, and so I encourage you to read that. Before that, of course, he was the author of the magisterial book, The Deluge, the Great Power, the Great War, and the Remaking of the Global Order, 1916-1931. So it's really thrilling to have you three here. Thank you for joining us, and we're going to start with you, Amna.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to launch right in. Our texts this week are not austere repositories of analysis. They are crass, oversimplistic, not fully worked out. But perhaps this is their power. They are designed not for close reading, but a sort of dirty engagement, to be used as tools in a growing toolkit, or perhaps better yet, to build an army or collective of praxis. In their simplicity and accessibility, in their assertion of an audience, in their aim to inspire hope and action, we can learn. These texts provoke emotion, including hope and possibility, the wellsprings of action. The simple actions the texts encourage: join with friends and make phone calls to your congressional reps, donate to Planned Parenthood, learn more about criminal injustice, makes change seem within reach. And the ease of action inspires you. It inspired me, like I talked briefly about on the blog post, to take action, however small. And I'm less interested, I'm going to not talk during my prepared remarks about the policy proposals proposed in Bernie's book, but more about the bid in both of these texts for collective action or mass mobilization. Indivisible's is, of course, more defensive in nature, and Bernie's is inoffensive, but is offensive. But the provocation for mass collective action is essential for changing our profoundly unjust now. That mass and collective part of praxis must be essential to our thinking, to our praxis, however uncomfortable and unchallenging it may be. I read this week's text alongside what you might think of as kind of a companion text, Charlene Carruthers' recent Unapologetic, a Black, Queer, and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements. And as Carruthers argues, the bid for the collective must be matched by a bid for taking seriously and taking on the racialized, gendered, and class distributions of resources and life chances. To understand what we face, we must understand the history that precedes us, as well as the struggles that do. I won't repeat my blog post in detail here because Bernard has reassured me that most of you have read. What I will do instead is share some notes on the praxis I've been engaged with since leaving New York a handful of years ago, taking on political work in service of people of color movements that have within their sights the history of colonialism, settler colonialism, and enslavement, the contemporary realities of racial capitalism and patriarchy, and movements that center the importance of transforming the very nature of power, of our institutions, of our relationships to ourselves, each other, the state, and the land. And partly the reason I'm doing this because Bernard encouraged us to kind of focus on what is productive about the text rather than try to tear them apart. And so I do that I do this from that space. But before sharing a few vignettes, I will say something I haven't quite worked out. I think there's something about the gap between prevailing discourse, whether in the text of the newspaper or the arguments of academic work, and the lives of people of color in this country that create routine contradictions between the written words we are surrounded with and our lived experience. And in this way, it feels as if we are always living a form of praxis, a practice that generates insights otherwise obscured and deeply powerful about what is and what was, how things are actually functioning, and how we might teach and understand them. So all of these vignettes, or at least the first three, are from the fall of 2014 in Ohio, which was the fall that Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown. Darren Wilson brutally killed Michael Brown right before my third year at Ohio State. I attended a panel organized by the Women, Gender, and Sexualities Department, curated after the riot, rebellion, uprising in Ferguson. The panel included 3 left feminist academics and a racial justice organizer. In my view, the academics did a brilliant job naming the histories of race and gendered inequity in the United States and the contemporary realities of police violence. Afterward, when the panel was over, the organizer said to me, "You left academics. It's almost as if you compete over who can name best how fucked up everything is. When you're done talking, everyone in the room is more depressed. The more you talk, the more it defeats the possibility of political action. It all just feels inevitable and unavoidable. It's enough to make you give up." 2, I went to a vigil for Mike Brown. A couple hundred people were huddled under a park pavilion in Columbus. Naming police violence and poverty, Black folks from all walks of life in Columbus placed the inequality in their communities within the context of the history of the Atlantic slave trade. Young Black organizers absorbed the grief and responded with a parallel. The devaluation of Black life persists from then to now, but so do the traditions of African American resistance. A better world will come only if we demand one, they insisted, if we make this one uncomfortable. This happened a mile away from the law school, where we don't talk much about enslavement or mass movements. The organizers were from the Ohio Student Association, a youth-led racial and economic justice organization. At the vigil, organizers recounted the experience of John Crawford, a 22-year-old Black man killed by police at a Walmart less than 2 hours away, 4 days before Darren Wilson killed Mike Brown. As one organizer spoke, others collected contact information from the crowd to circulate details about upcoming actions. People started to disperse, and the organizers sang songs. The OSA organizers were radiant in their embodiment of possibility and their grounding in history. And in their words and actions, I felt the long history of the Black freedom struggle come alive. Within a week, I was meeting with them regularly. Whenever I stopped by, organizers would be hard at work, huddled around laptops and fielding calls, strategizing about how to change local politics, cancel student debt, and raise the minimum wage, planning their next move in the Justice for John Crawford campaign. They dropped names like James Chaney, Ella Baker, and CLR James, community events for political education and consciousness-raising sessions. There were members organizing around the state and others flying around the country to partake in training and strategy sessions in support of the burgeoning national movement. As they pushed the work forward, they confronted ongoing tactical questions. Debates range from the value of Twitter to the role of protest, given their commitment to the slow haul of community organizing. I jumped into the Justice for John Crawford campaign, advising on civil disobedience actions, organizing legal observers and jail support, and accompanying organizers to meetings with cops and prosecutors. In our collaborations, I felt a thrilling confusion. The organizers' work felt much more rebellious, much more visionary, really, than the litigation and reform campaigns I was more familiar with. I had long felt that the mass mobilization of subordinated people was necessary for real social change, that lawyering and litigation were inadequate on their own. But as the organizers put into practice what I had preached, their actions tested many of my ingrained instincts, and they taught me, encouraged me to study history and intellectual traditions my years of formal education had systematically neglected and erased. And they changed my teaching as a result, too. One of the deepest lessons of that experience, one that took me months and months to grasp, was the centrality of our fight for power. That power wasn't something we were against, it was something we were for redistributing. It took me so long to grasp the simple concept that it made me wonder how gaps in knowing and being tend to reproduce themselves. 3. I walked alongside a few hundred protesters for 12 miles, from the Walmart where 22-year-old John Crawford was killed for handling a BB gun for sale to the courthouse where the grand jury deliberated over whether to criminally charge the police officer who killed Crawford. The sun was bright, the field separating the suburban Beaver Creek Walmart to the Dayton courthouse sprawling and verdant. As we walked, space and time changed in quality. We sang songs. Okay, now I can't sing, but I'm going to do this. Ella Baker was a freedom fighter, and she taught us how to fight. Say what? We gon' fight all day and night until we get it right. Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? We're on the freedom side. I felt connected to the freedom struggles of brown and black people in the United States. I remembered the histories I had read of the civil rights, black power, Chicano, and anti-war movements, the marches, the sit-ins, and occupations. Walking through the fields, the honks of the passing pickup trucks and the stalled traffic in turns menacing and supportive, we felt connected to each other, to those who came before, to histories we weren't taught in school. Our coming together felt transgressive, constitutive, and soaked in alternative possibilities. Another tomorrow felt within reach as we marched for miles in resistance to the prevailing political and social norms of the day, the same ones that had taken Crawford's life and led the grand jury to decide there was no probable cause to suggest the police had killed Crawford without justification. 4. Mary Hooks is an organizer with song, Southerners on New Ground. Song and Mary have done incredible visionary organizing, including playing a central role in organizing Mama's Day bailouts all over the country for the last few years. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting her and I don't know her, but this is a mantra of hers, one that Charlene Carruthers includes in her book, Unapologetic. The mandate for black people in this time is to avenge the suffering of our ancestors, to earn the respect of future generations, and be willing to be transformed in the service of the work. What is our mandate? Are we willing to be transformed in service of the work? We are in an old fight for enfranchisement on the large terrain of politics, and we are in desperate need for a broad and creative set of strategies mobilized by many publics. The Black radical tradition reminds us that the struggle to reorder our society, structured as it has been for centuries now by colonialism and enslavement, is not so simple as calling Congress or even electing Bernie Sanders. The task may be impossible. It will certainly be difficult and uncomfortable, but to find out, we have to agitate and move ourselves and each other toward collective action. Our praxis must involve engaging in deep dialogue and solidarity with people different than us, Black and other people of color, the working class, working poor and unemployed, immigrants and undocumented people, with those who are incarcerated or detained under probation and parole and police surveillance, with women, LGBT, gender nonconforming people, and with those differently abled. How do we remake this room in the shape of the movements we are hoping to build? Our praxis must take us outside of universities, or at least outside of the individualized mandates universities put on us as faculty. We need to join our students in asking new questions. We need to organize our universities. We need to join mass and base building organizations, build collective spaces, and contribute to social movements and party organizations. We need to listen to other people. We need to read and learn and teach, not in service of our careers, but in service of the collective. Our writing and our analysis will inevitably change as we dedicate ourselves to different forms of work, new collectives, and distinct channels of accountability. In all of our work, we need to be attuned to power, shifting it and building it. In movements and organizations seeking to build their power, what matters is not new ideas, but ideas that resonate, that repeat, that find their ways into our ears and vocabulary, and repeat, repeat, repeat. Like Bernie, Indivisible, and Carruthers, we don't have the answers. We can't have the answers because The answers quite literally reside beyond us. We have to answer the question, what do we do in conversation with a broader public in movements, movement organizations, and parties, instead of primarily in classrooms and journals? What do we do is not an abstract question. It is a concrete one, a strategic and tactical one that must account for the conditions, the context, our goals, and the state of our collectives. Our answers will be tentative and incomplete. Sometimes we'll make mistakes, but we will be engaged in the most fundamental act of resistance and tapped into the strongest currents of our imaginations, collective action. Thank you.
That was great. Yes, thank you, Amna. So before we move on to Brandon, I just wanted to. So there were a couple of things in there that I just wanted to highlight, so this idea of moving outside of the academy is really important, and in part, this engagement with these texts is trying to push us to do that in a way. You didn't say anything about critical theory, but you did say always staying tuned to relations of power, which I take it is a critical theory intervention, and also not kind of imposing views, but listening and hearing and listening to the discourses of others, which I also think has a critical theoretic component. So I just wanted to highlight a few of those ways in which your intervention makes important points that do possibly engage with some of these other, perhaps ancillary questions of how to think about it from a critical perspective. So thanks, Amna. Brandon, you want to grab that mic over there, make sure it's on. Just got to pull it towards you. Pull the thing up on the, there we go.
Is that good? Okay, so firstly, as always, I want to thank my dear brother and mentor, Bernard Harcourt, for inviting me down and for hosting yet another series of vital conversations. This one, I think, on a really important topic, and one probably nearer to my heart than Nietzsche, which is critique and praxis, although I did enjoy that one. It's a really daunting task that Bernard has set for us today, forcing us to answer or at least confront a question that many of us, I think, in our disciplinary decadence, persistently seek to evade, and that's namely what is to be done. Our shared text this evening posed the question of so-called political revolution raised by the Bernie Sanders campaign, or at least the self-conception of the Bernie Sanders campaign, the apparent revival of democratic socialism and formal politics, and the quote-unquote resistance to the Trump administration modeled on the Tea Party's usurpation of the Republican Party. It was fortuitous for me, though, that while I was preparing for this discussion on political revolution, praxis, and critique, I've been teaching a small little seminar on African-American political thought. And one of the remarkable things about the Black tradition, and I get reminded of it every time I teach a long survey on it, is that its various debates represent, in the old adage, a philosophy born of struggle. The conceptual and reconstructive resources that emerge from within this tradition, its enduring insights into and unmasking of fundamental forces within American politics and society, are profoundly informed by ethical, existential, and practical problems of social movement. How to initiate social movement, how to give it direction, sustain it, hold it accountable, honor it, and sacrifice for it. Black political thought also contains in its sparest form a kind of revolutionary disposition that helps approach this question of political revolution from a productive direction. Perhaps the truest thing ever written about African-American thought was Herbert Storing's remark that Black Americans are like a revolutionary, or more interestingly, perhaps, a founding generation. That is, they are in the difficult but potentially glorious position of not being able to take for granted given political arrangements and values, of having seriously to canvass alternatives, to think through their implications, and here we return to praxis, and make a deliberate choice. To understand the American polity, he goes on, one could hardly do better than to study, along with the work and thought of the founders, the best writings of the blacks who are at once its friends, enemies, citizens, and aliens. So my aim tonight in my brief remarks is to try to stage what I think is a missed encounter between the Sanders and resistance movements and some key insights from the African-American political tradition, which might help confront some of the confusions and contradictions that, as I see it, bedevil contemporary left politics. One thing that I won't be able to get to in the talk, but I submitted as the blog post, was a longer piece on identity politics and labor union organizing, so hopefully we can talk about that in Q&A. I do want to say briefly a word about what I am not up to, just so there'll be no confusion. I'm not raising the familiar claim that Sanders, in the ignoble tradition of American socialism, made a fatal mistake of ignoring racial injustice by reducing all questions of injustice to wealth inequality and political domination by capitalist elites. I actually do not see much evidence that Sanders operated under this confusion, nor do I think the record of American socialist thought is quite as abysmal on these questions as it is often carelessly represented. There are some people in the tradition that are like that, but it's actually a much more interesting tradition on that question than people give it credit for, often because they're not also reading African-American socialists. But from my vantage, the failure of the Sanders campaign was much more spectacular where it concerned the politics of race rather than the analysis of racial inequality. And let me say a little bit more about that. So far as I can tell, the Sanders campaign was simply blindsided by the class politics within black communities and the symbolic politics that reign among black elected officials, anti-racist activists, and pro-reparations intellectuals. That such figures would seek to discredit the Sanders movement, either to curry favor with the presumed favorite, Hillary Clinton, or simply to score ideological points, is something that they seem not to have anticipated. And so scrambling to shore up their credentials as appropriately inclusive within an already unsympathetic media environment, the Sanders campaign attempted to give pride of place to issues like criminal justice and immigration reform through a kind of race-based or civil rights frame. And in doing so, they genuflected toward existing activist frames, even where they did not cohere and often outright contradicted Sanders' own attempts to piece together a coherent narrative, one which would incorporate both a democratic socialist critique and an alluring vision of a democratic socialist future. This is probably most blatant in Sanders' attempts to incorporate immigration reform framed by anti-racism and civil rights into his broader vision of a New Deal, which explicitly and implicitly avails itself of nationalist presuppositions at nearly every turn. But more subtly, you take, for example, the chapter on criminal justice reform in the book, Sanders writes about incarceration, or what I would call hyper-incarceration, as a problem of racism, rather than a problem of race and class. So unlike W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, William Julius Wilson, Sanders never once differentiates the most disadvantaged within the black population, people who are poor and living in neighborhoods of concentrated and intergenerational poverty, joblessness, and residential segregation. These are the people within the black community whose lives are most dramatically destroyed by our contemporary carceral practices. Without this subtle connection, Sanders misses here a chance to talk about how America's unprecedented carceral population congealed not simply from racist animus, but from the profound economic dislocations of the late 20th century, racial stigma honed by years of cynical political propaganda and intra-class conflict over basic needs and opportunities, as well as, and I think this is really crucial, a profound fear of the moral and political agency of the oppressed, right? One of the big links, if you read my colleague Elizabeth Hinton's book about the transition from the war on poverty to the war on drugs and the war on crime, is precisely what you brought up, the fear of these black insurgent movements taking hold in the ghettos. So this is a crucial part of the story that you would think a socialist vision that's based on mass action would avail itself of this history to tell a story about why we want to empower these people again. So I get that this picture is more complicated, but I do think it would help clarify for someone like Sanders the complicity of democratic elites, including political elites, with the disastrous course we've been on over the past few decades, while speaking forthrightly to the potential power, the political power of the poor and working class minorities in politics, while also connecting carceral reform to a broader vision of economic justice. Now, that perhaps tips too much of my hand already, so let me turn back to the three provocations that I want to pursue with the rest of my time. So the first, which draws on W.E.B. Du Bois, is that polarization is not always the enemy. All right? The second, drawing from Martin Luther King, is that we are in desperate need of a return to progressivism's emphasis on corruption and a structural procedural imagination. And lastly, and perhaps most controversially, I think that all of these efforts may need to turn for the appropriate fervor and enthusiasm to a broader ethical revolt, a kind of spiritual revivalism against cynicism that touches our ethical life, cultural production, and our social movements. And here I will refer to Sanders' own ally and my dear friend and colleague, Cornel West. So let me begin with the discourse of polarization. I think it's difficult to listen or to read mainstream political commentary without coming across a lament about how polarized we are as a nation, how partisanship has become tribal. I don't want to dismiss these fears. After all, they raise a genuine threat to the future of the American polity. But I do want to press an important criticism against this discourse of polarization and any implicit call for reconciliation that doesn't take seriously the critique I'm about to advance. When we speak historically about polarization in America, we have to be careful to remember that in many respects, blacks were almost totally marginalized in American electoral politics and social scientific data until well into the 20th century. Where comedy and consensus have existed in American politics, it was often purchased at the price of broad racial subordination and consequently an ability to regard the claims of racial minorities with arbitrariness and impunity, right? Our narratives about polarization have built into them these same exclusions. We continue to ignore or obscure what was suppressed and defeated in the past rather than reconciled to some imaginary consensus. It should not be shocking, therefore, that it's precisely those moments where polarization reached their most explosive level, take, for example, the 1850s through the 1870s, that the dynamics of the racial order suffered sustained fundamental assault. The dangers and destabilization wrought by polarization were then largely subsumed by a new reconciliation in their aftermath based on a reassertion of white supremacy. So although the civil rights revolution of the mid-20th century has achieved what appear to be longer-lasting gains than Reconstruction, a similar dynamic might still be said to be at work. The broad range of egalitarian efforts, from the war on poverty to affirmative action to state-enforced integration, when's the last time you heard that one, were subjected to massive resistance from large swaths of America's white citizenry. The polarization of this era subsided only with a bipartisan effort to turn against these goals, to dismantle welfare, to expand incarceration, and to entrench opportunity hoarding and political supremacy underwritten by suburban borders. W.E.B. Du Bois was deeply attuned to this dynamic in American politics and produced a profoundly tragic historiography to underscore this peculiar threat that white racial solidarity poses to justice and democracy. In our moments of fracture and despair, the temptation to rebuild and reconcile on the terrain of whiteness will present itself and hold a great deal of allure for many of our fellow citizens. It is of utmost importance to recognize this threat and resist it where it raises its head. As Du Bois writes in The Souls of Black Folk, the growing spirit of kindliness and reconciliation between the North and South after the frightful differences of a generation ago ought to be a source of deep congratulation to all, and especially those whose mistreatment caused the war. But if that reconciliation is to be marked by the industrial slavery and civic death of those same black men with permanent legislation into a position of inferiority, then those black men, if they are really men, are called upon by every consideration of patriotism and loyalty to oppose such a course by all civilized methods. While Du Bois, assessing the likelihood of white allies and blinded by his own sexism, put the onus for resistance on black men, we have other sources for hope. Our current wave of polarization has a peculiar feature that perhaps we should embrace. It's the fact that partisan polarization seems to also be moving the racial attitudes of non-blacks on the left toward more progressive positions on questions like anti-discrimination, reparations, the nature of racial inequality, police brutality, and so forth. For me, one of the most remarkable, if not especially noticed, events since the Trump election was the attempted white supremacist march in Boston Common. There, a little over a dozen white nationalist demonstrators were drowned out and denounced by tens of thousands of Bostonians, almost entirely white. The difficulty, as always, will be turning these crystallizing anti-racist sentiments into something altogether more transformative. This would be a decisive fracturing of white solidarity and a political vigilance informed by this tragic Du Boisian understanding of American politics. Practically, this means a democratic disavowal of the sort of romantic rhetorical frames embraced by someone like President Obama, who drew heavily on the tropes of exodus and deliverance to describe our nation's march toward racial inclusion. In their stead, we need more clear-eyed warnings that the ostensible victories of the civil rights era, perhaps none more so than voting rights, are under severe assault. This again strikes me as a misconnection for the Sanders movement. As Martin Luther King strongly argued, the political subordination of African Americans was in part driven by a broader desire to undermine the possibility of a national political coalition capable of achieving egalitarian ends. The fear of black enfranchisement is not only about some abstract anti-blackness, it's also about the absolutely correct understanding prevalent among conservative elites that a genuine change in black social position would require the dramatic transformation of political economy and perhaps even the constitutional order, and that this is a fate impossible without black electoral empowerment. The morass of procedural corruption, from gerrymandering to voter identification statutes to campaign finance deregulation, all need to regain a kind of pride of place to make a democratic socialism truly democratic. Another feature of King's thought that might enhance our thinking on this contemporary question of political revolution is how, in framing something like the Montgomery bus boycott, he constantly treated questions of discrimination and domination as matters of fundamental dignity and self-respect. He was not afraid, in other words, to insist to black people themselves that their dignity and self-respect is at stake when other citizens try to thwart their basic liberties. Far too much of the discussion on voter suppression, which is a core tactic of the GOP's embrace of minoritarian rule, remains trapped in the pundit class's interest in immediate electoral outcomes and partisan strategy. King helps us recover the kind of righteous indignation that such policies should provoke and reminds us of the important moral fervor that should be summoned when we suffer such bald injustice. These questions of democracy and procedure are also questions of recognition, respect, dignity, and self-worth. Now, I want to end, given this kind of existential ethical claim, on my last provocation. So at bottom, many of the policies and practices of the Trump administration would be enacted by any Republican government. This is not meant to reassure us, but to horrify us at the radicalism of the US conservative movement in the wake of Obama's election. Trump does, however, raise a particularly acute concern that contrasts, I think, profoundly with Sanders. At its core, the Trump movement is an embrace of cynicism. It makes a mockery of conventional moral appeals and honorifics, claims to unmask the pretense of our society to reveal its true arbiters of money, strength, and self-assertion. Any positive socialist vision, as opposed to simply Marxist critique, must defend against this cynicism the ability of people to cooperate, to appreciate each other's capabilities and respect them as fellow citizens, and somehow their ability to hold at bay inevitable temptations to cheat, extort, and exploit. Cynicism, when enshrined in the highest office in the land, represents and deepens our current crisis of faith in the idea that cooperation and mutual respect are worth the discipline, sacrifice, and self-constraint they demand. So when my brother Cornel West was on the road for Sanders, he gave a speech in Iowa, and only a principled socialist would send Cornel West to stump in Iowa. He gave this speech on the virtue of constancy, and I encourage all of you to listen to it. Commentators often spoke of both Trump and Sanders as dual sides of a kind of revolt of authenticity against the establishment, but they do present two starkly different pictures of what authenticity would entail. And I think Cornell's remarks on constancy help illuminate that. So one, Trump's view is the cynical view, where only suckers try to play by the rules or live up to any ideals beyond acquisition, dominance, and when contingently useful, solidarity with your group. The other idea is this idea of constancy, where there are principles and commitments that can't be sacrificed for profit or popularity. There is, of course, much to be suspicious of in the jargon of authenticity, but whether or not that's the ultimate vocabulary we embrace, we need some domain from which to turn the tide against nihilism and totalizing pessimism. What kind of mass movement could be built in this cultural condition without some kind of ethical and spiritual renewal? These texts give us plenty to do, but an attempt to revive trust and rebuild practical faith may require more spectacular forms of sacrifice and everyday enactments of solidarity than laid out here. We are in desperate need of efforts that might ultimately coagulate into a different orientation toward our dark times, one which is willing to lay everything on the line to show that our life together is more than crime, decadence, and deceit all the way down. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. That was brilliant. And just a couple of thoughts for those who have been for the students and those who have been following. The notions of polarization and resisting reconciliation is particularly interesting. I think it really ties back to our first seminar and Stephen Luke's intervention and the whole discussion about reworking the norms that have existed in the past, right, or not, and so I really enjoyed that a lot. Also, but overall, the intervention really raises questions about the disjuncture somehow, or how we should think about the disjuncture between the stories, right, the interpretive framework that is presented, and then the program, the policy proposals, right? I mean, how we think about this in terms of, it's a question of ends and means, and Guylaine wrote about that in her post. It's a question about the ends and means and how to think about, can you just separate the policy proposal or not from all of the discourse that either supports or doesn't support or problematizes it or not. And so, and hopefully we'll come back to that in the discussion. Adam, do you want to grab the mic and?
Well, as Brandon, in fact, Amna said as well, this was not an easy assignment, and it's only become more difficult as I've listened to the brilliant contributions of my two co-panelists. Those are very hard acts to follow for many different reasons. What I hope I can contribute alongside them is perhaps something more modest by focusing some close criticisms on the book that has Sanders' name on it. I do that in part for practical reasons, pun intended, but also because I'm not sure that my personal position permits anything else. My sense of being located, listening to my two predecessors on the panel, this sense became ever closer, stronger in me. My sense of being located, of having a political praxis against which to contrast this text or from which to criticize it, is so profoundly tenuous at this point. The question of praxis, the question of identity and place, these aren't questions I think I can currently answer satisfactorily. Listening to you, in fact, I began to wonder whether, as a migrant since my early childhood, I'm not sure I've ever been able to answer them satisfactorily or ever will be. In Hirschman's terms, I have at times exercised voice as a citizen, but the option, the experience, the attraction, the allure of exit has always been perhaps too close. Of course, I'm in the fortunate position of holding a passport, but it's in fact probably true that, in Theresa May's immortal words, I'm currently a citizen of nowhere, certainly in any thick sense of the word of citizenship. Or rather, the thing, Europe, that I do feel a deep commitment to is a thin thing. The thing I feel thickly about is itself thin, tenuous, a cold mother indeed. Indivisible, in fact, contains a telling proviso that they aren't necessarily sure that they recommend anyone following their advice if you don't have, or if you are in an uncertain citizenship status. That applies to me in a privileged and upholstered position, of course, but nevertheless at the whim of a bureaucracy that has to renew my green card, and it's not a bureaucracy that you want to mess with. So the first thing, reading Sanders's book from this odd position that I occupy, is what strikes me first is the title itself, Revolution. This is a very strange title to give to a manifesto that offers a sensible nuts and bolts approach to pressing and obvious social and economic problems in the US, but proposes to overthrow or radically transform nothing, as far as I can see. For reasons I'll come on to, it does not even seem to me to warrant the label of social democracy. Why use such a striking word in the title? Reading the manifesto as a European, there's one obvious answer. It's an American political document. Who else could conceive of this program as a revolution? Who else would use that term so casually? Where else in the Western world would such language actually resonate at this moment, if assuming that this does here, which I am not in a terribly good position to judge? The Americanism in the text goes deep. My story, our story, Sanders tells us, is the story of America. It's a text which is nationalist in its assumptions. It's a problem if America's population, America's kids, are not the best educated in the world. America in Sanders's text is the greatest power. Fair enough, but more surprisingly, Sanders assumes that when Americans of today are confronted by their grandchildren over their failure to do anything about climate change, it still will be, which I think is a far more tenuous assumption to be making, and to be making it implies some options that we might want to talk about. It's not entirely solipsistic, like much American political discourse, but it's a text which is methodologically nationalist, i.e. it treats the US as a national entity to be compared with others. The nation for Sanders is a social and biopolitical unit that needs some repair and some grooming. He explicitly invokes youth as the future of the nation, one of the oldest tropes in the nationalist lexicon. In Europe, the Europe I grew up in, the West Germany I grew up in, we used to imagine, and some of us still do imagine, that the young people of the future will be the future of something other than the nation. Its proposals are squarely national, both in the large and the small sense. It goes without saying that America should lead, even on issues in which it just has absolutely no claim to leadership, like climate change. In its economics, it assumes that there are not just jobs, but American jobs that should not be moved abroad. It paints a picture of a bright future in which Americans have paid holidays like Europeans, and when Sanders imagines what they will do with their newfound time, he imagines them recuperating from overwork, visiting their families, and traveling the country. One can almost hear the strains of Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land" blasting. But what if Americans choose to do with their new free time a la European what Europeans do, which is to go on cheap packages to somewhere with sun and cheap booze like Mexico or the Dominican Republic? My sense is that in the US, all of this is simply reflex. It isn't really a political choice on Sanders's point, it's just simply the reflex. The fixation of political rhetoric on the nation is totally unreflected, despite the shock of Trump. This is one of the really toxic elements of MAGA. It sucks its opponents into their own versions of the same national game, their own visions of making America sane again, for instance, or radical as it once was. But Trump didn't start it. In truth, it's the lingua franca of American politics. Obama's language was resolutely national in its own way, of course, obviously a much more sophisticated lexicon. Indeed, it would require an effort of the imagination, a huge effort of the imagination, to conceive of a politics in the US which was not national, that was not appealing to land or soil or specific culture, that was truly transnational or cosmopolitan as opposed to international, which Sanders is evidently a hardened exponent of internationalism, and one can credit him with that. Sanders doesn't even make that effort, and it is a lot to ask, but I do find it striking that there's really no mention of cross-border solidarity. One could imagine, for instance, union organizations across the American-Mexican border as a key area of left mobilization, beyond the suggestion that if America unilaterally changed its bad free trade policies, then other folks would be better off. The immigrant issue is treated entirely with regard to people who are already here. The future flows are bracketed, and a longer-term vision of America's relation with Mexico and Central America is completely lacking. That is the way in which he neutralizes the problem. It's evident, I think, to all people of goodwill that we have to do something for the undocumented who are already here. But the question of the future of America's relation is just framed out. So it becomes something that America itself can resolve without having to deal, in fact, with the outside world from which these people come. Again, all of this is striking because in Europe right now, the question of the national, the transnational, the European is the central and highly controversial issue, both in politics and in political praxis. And not just on the right, where it's not controversial, but on the left, where it is. And this is the central question for the German left and the French left, particularly at the current moment. So this is my first question. What is the role of patriotic appeals and motivations in political praxis? If that's too concrete, one might ask, what are the generalities within which appeals and action are framed? If Sanders is a typical voice of the American left right now, its appeal is classic patriotic republicanism in a mode that goes back to the 18th century. And believe it or not, and it's one of the extraordinary features of this extraordinary book, that it in fact includes at the back a helpful guide to regime types. If you were wondering about what government in America was, it provides a list at the end, in which it literally does repeat the civics lesson about how America distinguished itself from absolute monarchy, theocracy, and military dictatorship. It literally does this work for you. More pressing, surely, is the question, and it is a question begged by all of Sanders' manifesto, is what in fact differentiates America at this point from an oligarchy, which is listed amongst the regime types. Everything about Sanders' argument would suggest that that is a real question in the present, but my sense is that he shrinks from it for fear of causing offense, perhaps, or perhaps simply because this is one of the limits of the nationalist political imagination in the US, however radical. America, or at least some version of America, was born free. So the possibility of true degeneration is really quite hard to contemplate. One of the classic functions of this kind of patriotism in political rhetoric is admirably displayed by Sanders' text, because what it does is to render less glaring its vagueness and opacity when it comes to the description of American society and who and what his politics stands for. And both of you have brilliantly, I think, skewered the question of race and the problem of race in his writing, which I agree is not a simple one. What you didn't mention is that in his discussion of incarceration, he doesn't talk about class, but he does talk about mental illness, which is, of course, closely correlated with class. Well, and he does mention the fact that stress causes mental illness, but he never really triangulates the three things. Again, to anyone steeped in European social and economic history, the fluidity and vagueness of the language is simply dizzying. And this is what, to my mind, disqualifies this book as having any claim really to being social democratic. Which was, of course, in its own way shifty when it came to sociology, European social democracy in particular, but not this shifty. Having said that, Sanders' book does depend on the description of American society, but this is perhaps where the question of where social theory comes in is really neuralgic. What kind of a description is it? A few things are clear. Today there are billionaires, and at the other end of the social hierarchy there are poor people. Then there are working poor people, and then there is that great white whale, the great sort of obfuscating entity of American politics, the struggling middle class. This current scenario is then contrasted to a former era which was dominated in this narrative by good paying. I don't know why it's always this incredibly ungrammatical phrase, good paying, blue collar jobs, which you got straight out of high school with union benefits, et cetera, which hasn't, admittedly, existed for half a century. So it's a kind of golden age move in which we describe a society by way of reference to a social model which it no longer matches. But it begs the question of what connection is between those two worlds. Those folks in the 50s, were they middle class? Hardly. They didn't go to college or have much hope of doing so. They worked manual, repetitive jobs. You can't and don't want to go back there now, so is the aspiration, is the guiding social model that as many people as possible should become middle class, despite the inherent kind of paradoxes of that kind of vision of social uplift? For which, of course, the ticket is college education, but then you shrink from saying college education should be for everyone, because that's clearly unrealistic in some sense, but you also know it's not just unrealistic. Large segments of American population are thoroughly browned off by education by the time they finish high school, and as Sanders himself said, can't and don't want to go to college. So then you concede in passing that we need skilled people as plumbers and electricians, and then you add with a kind of passing glance that it would be good if there were trade unions, and that's kind of the limit of the sociological analysis that the text offers. It's a sort of fragmentary social theory that doesn't really fundamentally engage with the topography of American disadvantage, which would immediately reveal the kind of intersex that Brandon was highlighting. Now, political language is rarely crisp when it comes to social categories, so the question really has got to be what is gained by this opacity. And I'm not sure I can really answer it in this case. After all, Sanders doesn't want to make an actual revolution. It's not clear he has a model of how power will be exercised. And this goes back to what Bernard started with. I think the premise is simply that there are enough people of goodwill in America and the problems are so glaring that all we really need to do is sort of remark on these facts for it by itself to become a vector of change. A slightly more tactical vision does become apparent in the text at a different point. Sanders is a sharp critic of corporate America, but only up to a point. He singles out the banks for a whole chapter. He's hot over tax evasion. But then you look at the list of offenders on tax evasion, and it's really quite astonishing. It's GE, it's a company called Johnson Control Systems, and IBM. And when I got to IBM, I really came up short, because there is no mention in this book whatsoever of the tech giants of the present moment, the actual oligarchs of modern American capitalism. No mention amongst the tax evaders of Apple, Facebook, and Google. Amazon doesn't have any profits to evade with, but Apple, Facebook, and Google. Why not? What kind of a political economy is being conjured in this text? Is it in its own way as anachronistic as the political economy of a Trump, which thinks that steel and aluminium are still the beating heart of American capitalism? Are Apple, Facebook, and Google perhaps too popular to make them targets of critique? Are they notionally part of his coalition? Certainly that's what one could see in the Obama second term, the recruitment of relations with Google. Or are they just simply outside Sanders' political and political economic imagination? Instead, we have the promise that broadband is a necessity and something close to being a human right, and TED Talks are suggested as vehicles for political education. So there seems to me a kind of innocent embrace of what, for many of us now, is in fact the cutting edge and the real leading edge of a critical political economy in the present. So with an evasive political economy and a sloppy sociology, with the nation as the only really solid category, the real frame of the analysis, I don't think it's surprising where we end up. Take the passage on Wall Street regulation and climate change. The time is long overdue for real financial reform in this country, the text tells us. It will not be easy, given the enormous power of Wall Street and its political supporters, but it is absolutely necessary. Take climate change. Of course, we must not, we cannot, and we will not allow that to happen. It seems to me basically a kind of naked democratic voluntarism. It's a fleshed out, of course, with the endnotes on each chapter suggesting how one might engage with the causes. I, in fact, found it unsettling and inspiring in the way Brandon and I were comparing notes on how inadequate it made us feel. I obviously have particular reason for feeling inadequate in that respect. But it seems to me to just hang in midair. This is a kind of a voluntarist gesture more than anything else. And surely the most obvious question to ask about the book is the presence in it of Sanders himself. I mean, the book appeals to the young, But it is studied. You really, if you've had it in your hands, you need to see it. It's this extraordinary kind of scrapbook book. The book is studied with images and words of the man himself. The words in particular, I don't know whether it's an unconscious or conscious mirroring of Trump, are tweets. So we get little gobbets of Sanders tweets. We see Sanders on marches, at rallies, giving speeches, standing outside closed factories. In one weird image, he seems to rise out of a large fog of dry ice, which is a little disconcerting in its kind of Wagnerian rhetoric. But there's no disguising the fact that these are images of a grizzled, I checked online, 77-year-old white man. Now, if that man takes seriously the politics he agitates, if the future really does belong to the young, as it should, I frankly hope this is his farewell address. It is, by any reasonable measure, his time to retire.
All right. So, yeah, that's not going to get you denied your green card. All right. Let me make a few comments, and then let me open it up to get a few thoughts, and then we'll come back to the panel. So this whole question of using the word revolution, I think, is really important, and that you brought up, Adam. And only in America could you trivialize the term, perhaps. I mean, the way I had now, actually, if I'm not mistaken, Macron's book also has revolution in the title. Isn't that right? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Well, those would be the two.
Yeah. Right. As you all know, Etienne Balibar was Macron's master. No. That's what you were referring to, right? No, but Macron's book also uses the word revolution in it, right? So so it's possible that it's not the only country where it could be used. I had originally thought that, and written in the introduction, that the use of the qualifier political was important there, going back to our discussion actually from Uprising 113 with Etienne about the modern conception of revolution as being one that had discarded or moves from political revolution to social revolution. Now, obviously, there's no social revolution here, so maybe by qualifying it as political revolution, in some sense, it's taming it, right? It's bringing it back. It's bringing it back actually earlier to a modern, earlier than the modern conception of revolution. But taming it in such a way that it's not clear what it would mean with the CIA definitions of regime types that he uses at the end of the book. Yes, those are the CIA. Those are the, well, it says it's the Central Intelligence Agency describes 31 different forms of government around the globe in its World Fact Book. Most are variations on these major types. So it's, yeah. But I mean, I suppose the notion of political revolution here is that somehow we've departed from democracy as defined here, and we need to return to it. I mean, that would be the only way in which there would be some coherent notion there. Or it's just it's just marketing, right? And which is what you were suggesting. But I somehow felt that the term somehow we have to analyze the term political in front of political revolution and understand it differently. I do sense this deep anachronism in the text, right? So insofar as it is written by someone who's spent many years in government and has a vision, I think, this vision of middle-class jobs and security that is one that is somewhat outdated, and but is threaded throughout the whole text in that way. But here's, I mean, one question I want to ask before I'm going to open it up to other questions is, so to have on the table, and we'll come back to it, is how do we deal with the sloppy sociology that you were discussing, Adam, but also Amna and Brandon were also referring to this notion of sloppy analysis, particularly on race, right? And so a facile use of racial discrimination as a vector that is intended to motivate, but without, as both Amna and Brandon were emphasizing, without a more complicated understanding of issues of intersectionality with class and poverty and gender and other forms of difference. So now we've got that. So we've got that sloppiness. We've got that simplicity. It's a very simple text, right? And as you were suggesting, I mean, it's really worth looking at because, right? It's a I mean, it's a graphic novel. It has a graphic novel. It's a picture. It's a picture book, right? But of many of the graphs that we as academics deploy, right? Except it's done in a slightly different kind of graphic representation. But many of these graphs are ones that I myself, I mean, you know, I have many of these slides as academic slides that I will use to show, you know, the U-curve or mass incarceration or the war on drugs or whatever. But it is represented in a graphic way as kind of a graphic novel. And so one of the major questions here is that simplicity and simple sociology and graphic representation. Like, how do we relate that then to at least some of the concrete policy proposals, right? Now, there are some areas where the policy proposals are more vague. I agree. Climate change is more vague. It's pretty clear that the chapter on climate change is one of positionality rather than specificity. Immigration is also pretty vague. A path to citizenship for 11 million people. You know, we don't know what that path is. Other ones are very specific. And many of them would be important programs for this country. Universal single-payer healthcare, free higher education. I mean, you know, funded with a 0.50% 0.50% tax on every stock trade. I mean, those are specific interventions that would bring about significant change. How do you separate the simplicity of the analysis, the lack of full understanding of relations of power, the failure to challenge relations of power, and that was something that I think is common to the three of you and to the interventions, Gideon's piece as well, right? Complete failure. It's using existing structures of power, and that's what the Indivisible manual does as well, right? It's using, but not challenging, not trying to really turn over to have a real revolution. How do we reconcile those with the fact that there are some policy proposals in here that I suppose we would all embrace, right? And would consider that this country was in a significantly different place if they were in fact adopted, right? And then how much do we then chalk this to political means, political strategies, political tactics, which obviously don't fly very well in an academic setting, but did pretty well in 2015, 2016, right? Okay, so let me open it up to others who might want to start the conversation with some comments. Sammy, do you want to start? You want to take the mic over there and...
Okay. One thing that was striking for me in reading the book, I think, Adam, you touched on it a little bit with the cross-border solidarity, was that there was nothing about an anti-war or an anti-military movement in the book. Even though he talked a lot about connecting different things, there's nothing connecting military spending and oppression abroad to what's happening at home. And Brandon, I remember last year at Riverside Church, you discussed this issue a little bit. So I'm just wondering what's the panel's view on creating a space for making that connection to any sort of movement on the left right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah. And I think the only mention, I'll have to go back and look, but I think the only mention of the military was in the context of demilitarizing the police force. But yeah, so, and obviously that goes to these questions of nationalism that Adam had brought up. Okay. Other questions? Yes, Reinhold. Can you flip on just on the upside there? Push that towards you. Yeah. There we go. Thanks.
These wonderful provocations. A lot to say. I just have a couple of thoughts right now that might be relevant because I'm trying to, in my mind, follow the script a little bit, Bernard, that you began with respect to what you're referring to as critical theory. I'm assuming this would at least include the Frankfurt School and a dialectical understanding of history. So on the one hand, I would read these documents, and I'm curious how others react, because not necessarily as social theory or political theory per se, but as archival documents, as sort of evidence of something. And the question is of what? And of course, we in our moment today are also asked, and by the texts themselves and by our own historical consciousness, to consider, as you said, the potentials for praxis that these might have. Well, it seems to me there are some differences that are worth, these things can be compared in a useful way. In shorthand, it seems that we have, on the one hand, a manual for sort of #resist, the Indivisible group, and then the other we have the possibility, if not the actuality, as Adam, I think, pointed out well, for something like #oppose. I mean, this would be the Du Boisian, I think, and it is striking how difficult it is to hear the word opposition when one is speaking about basically anti-fascist practice. And that's the salute to the Frankfurt School. Basically, Bernard, it seems to me that the oppositional, agonistic relationship to power, in this case, racial capitalism, the oligarchies that Sanders talks about, and so on, is maybe promised but not there by the word revolution, etc. But where I think, and this is one point, and then just one little anecdote, that we might be able to do some work with this, is it seems to me that what Sanders, the significance of Sanders is essentially performative in both senses. The theatrical sense that you're talking about. He's a personality, he's a character, he's funny. But also in the sense of putting the word socialism back into the American public sphere. It is very American. It's terribly embarrassing. Adorno would laugh. He'd laugh with Nietzsche at this. Socialism, finally, they're talking about socialism. But, and we could ask, is this an empty signifier? Is it just, nothing? Or is there something, or something very specifically that can be done with it? That's what strikes me. And I think a lot of the movements, the grassroots organizing, the youth especially, are trying, and the discourse, like a magazine like Jacobin, or something like that, the DSA, they're trying to do something with this word that may bear some, relation to its traditions in ways that even, someone like Sanders doesn't expect or anticipate. That's a possibility. Interesting that I don't know, I got an email today from The Nation. I don't know if you guys get these. Kate Aronoff, who writes for them and for The Intercept and so on, just wrote a piece that says that the people in the White House, specifically the Council on Economic Advisors, are taking this seriously enough to produce a 74-page paper about it.
Yes.
The opportunity cost of socialism.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, I haven't had a chance really to read it, just skimmed it, but it seems...
Can I elaborate?
Yeah, did you read it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It is a truly astonishing
Yeah.
document, which starts with the statement 200 years on from the,
On Marx's
from the bath
birthday.
of Marx, socialism is alive and well and
Right.
roaming, you know,
And
a
who
spectre
wrote-
haunts the United
Right, right,
States,
right.
and its name is
Yeah.
socialism.
Yeah.
And it goes on to draw...
Hold on, and who wrote
Council
this?
of Economic
Council of
Advisors,
Econo-
no less.
Yeah.
And it doesn't bear a signature, it's just the
It's the
council.
White
It's
House.
the,
It-
it's
it's
the,
go
it's
to
the White
whitehouse.gov.
House's chief economic
Yeah.
advisory team
Right.
have produced the document,
Right.
which has an extraordinary range of choice moments. The world of Twitter has spent a lot of time today dissecting it.
Have they already? Okay.
It draws a line from the Ukrainian famine
Yes.
to single-payer healthcare by way of Venezuela and the Nordics.
Right.
It sets out to demonstrate that Nordic social democracy is a disaster because people of Nordic ancestry,
Yes, yeah.
quote unquote,
Right.
in the United States have higher incomes than average Americans, whereas in Sweden they have a lower income than they would in the United States. And this cannot be, quote, due to any cultural preference for low income amongst people of Scandinavian origin. And it actually features as its prime comparison, I kid you not, an index benchmarking the cost of operating a pickup truck in the United States against a cost of operating a
yes,
pickup truck in
perfect.
Finland.
It's a graph.
Seriously, the pickup truck has been
have it. You wanna see?
promoted to the statistical index of the success of Trumpian economic
Yes,
policy. I mean, not just symbolically the Ford F-150, but literally
you.
now built into this statistical measure. It's, you know, it's as though the Finns never drove off-road, though they are the world champion rally drivers, and, you know, America monopolizes. It's an extraordinary testament to our times. Yeah. Well worth
Yeah.
your time.
So it seems to me, anyway, what I was going to say, I mean, I don't know if you agree, that we could read this side by side with these other documents as a portrait of
Yes.
the political imagination.
Okay.
But a footnote would be, it seems that the specter that's haunting this is not Sanders, I think it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other
Yes.
political figures who do represent a different kind of intersection of a form of opposition, potentially at least, to this. Anyway, so that's
Yeah,
those are
but
the
let,
two.
let me just ask you one question, though, about the element, the socialist element here.
Yeah.
I had the impression that it was buried here.
I guess,
It's
yeah,
totally
okay.
buried, right? In the book, in this book,
doesn't matter.
right? It doesn't surface as it,
Right.
so it doesn't present.
Yeah.
In fact, I was just checking the index, and the only reference to socialism is to the CIA definitions of regime types on page 202. So, but yeah, it seems as if, it does seem as if, right, that it's, I mean, although it's indisputably, factually a representation, I suppose, of democratic socialism, that it's buried in the text.
Yeah. I don't think there's very much socialism at all in the actual text. I'm agreeing with Adam's assessment, basically, but there's the word, and it's not so much this word, it's when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez goes on Colbert, and he has to ask her, are you or have you ever been a socialist? What does it mean to be a democratic socialist? That kind of performativity. And now that can be neutralized very, very quickly, very easily, surely, but that was unthinkable. You know what, 5 years ago, maybe 10 years, at least 10. So the unthinkability of that is interesting to me. I think that it has epistemic consequences potentially. You know, it could be nothing. It could be exactly what kills socialism finally, you know, in this country and anywhere else. I don't know, but it seems to me significantly different than measuring this against actually existing parameters that we understand as socialist, and particularly those that you know, of the Du Boisian sort. So.
Great, thanks, Reinhold. Can we take one more, and then, yes, Xavier, do you want to stand up and scream, or, yeah.
Yeah, and I go back to what Bernard you were saying about the qualifier of political revolution, and to me, actually, that qualifier of political revolution is actually even more damning towards the text, because it shows just how shallow is a analysis of the problem of political institutions and of political power are, and the classic example of this would be Citizens United. You know, one of the few things he talks about and he wants to change. But, you know, anyone who talks about Citizens United in terms of thinking about distribution of political power have to immediately take the next step and talk about the Supreme Court, the people who gave us this document. And it seems on the whole, you know, when it comes to actually changing political institutions, all he can think of doing are rolling back some of the most retrograde things that the Republican Party has done in the last decade, whether that's voter suppression or Citizens United. Any actually substantial engagement with the political structure of the United States, whether that is, you know, our Supreme Court, our uniquely undemocratic Supreme Court with such huge power. You know, brief reminder, back in Athens, the most powerful position, so-called president of the assembly, was president for 24 hours. Here we have our Supreme Court for life. So the Supreme Court would be one example, and the use of the Constitution to give us things like Citizens United would be another. So there's this whole host of the larger political system that gets completely lost, and again, we're sort of this fairy tale where if everyone could vote, and if African Americans could vote, and if corporations could spend so much money, then we would be back in a democracy, which to me seems extremely simple.
Thanks, Xavier. All right, let me connect that then, and then I'm going to turn back to Amna. I'll start with you. To one question also that we have received from Harvey Young in Stoke in the United Kingdom, which actually, so it's a 1,000-word intervention. So I'm going to summarize it quickly and then raise the question. But it has to do with the question of intergroup conflict, right? And essentially some of the issues that we have raised in terms of intergroup conflict. And asks whether it's possible, whether there is in this text, it seems, some ideal aspiration of getting beyond that, and whether it's at all even possible, right? So the question is it possible to act politically beyond the realist norms of self-interest that themselves only legitimate intergroup conflict, or at best temporary shared tactical mutual interest? But the question essentially, which in part follows on Xavier's, has to do with the question of how do we think about intergroup competition, basically, right? And how is it imagined in these works, Indivisible and in Bernie Sanders, but how can we think about it? So, Amna, do you want to start with some of these issues and some reflections?
Yeah, I mean, in thinking about all the comments made so far, I guess one thing that's worth naming is I don't think that Sanders' text takes on in any meaningful way either the national security state. And I think it doesn't take it on in at least two different ways. One is that I don't think there's a serious attempt in the text to think about how to move us away from the deeply punitive forms of governance under which we live. Sure, there's some gesturing to kind of deal with mental health crisis differently, to police a little differently, and to decriminalize, but kind of the central questions about the way that penalty is kind of embedded with governance, I don't think are taken on. So, for example, in the criminal justice and immigration reform chapters, he talks about ending private prisons, and this one really made me cringe, basically making immigrant detention better, and as well as some stuff about police training. But there's nothing major about decarceration or decreasing the power that police have. And here it might be in part, I think, some of the conflict around his different commitments, because he goes to, there's some great language in there that's kind of commending how hardworking police are, which kind of, I think,
and underpaid.
Yeah, right, underpaid and hardworking that they are, which maybe reflects some of these different commitments he has around race and labor, and how to think about them. And nor does he give us any real way to think about how we divorce questions of crime from race. So I think there's a lot lacking there. And then the second way I think it doesn't take on the national security state has to do with some of the points that Adam made, and then I think it was Sammy over there, where there's no mention of war. There's no mention of our military bases around the world. I think it's the climate change section. He talks about, climate change is a crisis facing us. And there's some throwaway language in there about the kind of national security and ISIS without kind of problematizing what that means or thinking about the role of the United States in creating that crisis. Or similarly, in the immigration section, there's talk of, the migration crisis, and the only finger he points self-reflectively is at NAFTA, but there's nothing more deep about American foreign policy. So I don't think there's any real attempt to reconfigure or rethink the question of the role of the United States around the world, which I think is an important one. But strangely, in this group, I feel a little bit like I want to defend the text, because despite all of my problems with it, I don't think it's meant to be a sophisticated or complete analysis of our condition or where we are or what we should do. I think there's some analysis here that, kind of this is what we're ready for, and I think on the left we haven't thought seriously about, kind of taking down American empire, rethinking the role of the United States on the world. We haven't really had a deep enough confrontation with the role of the punitive state in our governance, and some, like the Movement for Black Lives Policy Platform, for example, does push on that. It's not that movements and organizations aren't thinking about it or people here and there aren't, but I think in terms of a mass movement, mass conversation, deeply questioning either of these kind of faces, the national security state, domestic or international, I don't think we're there from Democrats all the way to the left. And so I think there's some calculation here of what are kind of the issues that we can get people to move on, to come together around, and that then maybe we can kind of take on some of these deeper questions. That might be too hopeful, but, and I might be getting this number wrong, but I think from my friends who are in DSA, I think right after the election, DSA surged by 10,000 or plus members, and I mean, that in itself is extraordinary, and it's because of Sanders, and I think that there's something incredible about that. It doesn't mean that the work is finished or that, I'm sure the demographics there are mostly white and male, but on the other hand, the fact that we have both, community-based organizations and movements and, that are kind of ebbing and flowing, that are led by people of color, and DSA that is interracial but predominantly white, I think this is all important because we need organizations that are kind of pushing these questions of collective governance and pushing us to think about, different aspects of these questions and moving people to act. And I think that's the real purpose of this text, just like it is of Indivisible. And for that, I think it should be celebrated, whatever the flaws are.
So, okay, before we go to Brandon, I'm just going to push you on that for a second, because I've noticed that my role in these seminars has become to defend the text. So I appreciate that. But I just want to push you on it, because, so is the defense here that, well, maybe it's not even the text you're defending somehow. Maybe what you're defending is Sanders' political engagement more broadly, or is it something about the text actually, or is it just that gosh, there aren't that many politicians out there able to attract this much interest. There aren't that many politicians out there able to get this many votes or to bring about some following that includes universal health care, free education, et cetera, right? So is it kind of like, so, yeah, so what is it exactly that you are defending here? It would be helpful for me since I'll step in and defend something else.
Right, let me see to the extent that I can clarify. I mean, I think it's not just that he's a politician who has moved more people than other politicians. He's moved more people in some sense than other movements, and certainly than any academics, right? So his capacity to connect with and translate a broad set of claims, not just for what's wrong with the United States, but a fairly different vision of what it might look like, even if it doesn't go far enough, I think is pretty powerful. So I think that's part of it. And sure, I'm thinking about Sanders more broadly. I can't separate the text from that. But I hadn't read anything he had written until I read the book. And like I talked about in my blog post, I did find myself mid kind of, actually this was Indivisible, which, you know, we didn't talk about. That's even more, you know, corrupt in a sense. I found myself, I signed up for the email listserv of my Republican senator, and because they convinced me that it was important to do, and that it might help me be more politically engaged. Now, with different texts or different campaigns, like for example, what happens often on Facebook, you're kind of convinced that when you click on or subscribe something or sign a petition, that that's kind of, you've done something good and you can rest easy. But I think there's something about the Sanders book in particular, perhaps because of its balance of critique and vision, again, however corrupt, that you know he's not just asking you to click or just join the food bank, but he's asking you to join a collective process of building out a vision and joining with other people to then agitate and do these projects together. And there's something about that that I think is deeply powerful.
And so, I mean, how many people, just here's a show of hands, how many people had read this book before we assigned it for the seminar?
One over here.
One. Okay. And why? No. I mean. So like, so how did that happen?
Somebody recommended it to me.
Yeah. Okay. So because I mean that is an interesting. I mean that's now maybe it's because this is an academic setting and this is not an academic book. Maybe it's because we don't tend. But I mean it would be interesting empirically to try and figure out what effect a book like this has. Right? Many politicians write books. Mm-hmm. Right, and there's often it's mostly it's either a platform book or a biography book, an autobiography book. Anyone who's running for president, all of the people who are running for president probably have, and often they don't write them themselves. Right, very often, and it's not clear who wrote this book, really. Yeah.
So I can add a little bit. I was at the launch, which was, or at least one of the launch. This is basically a campaign speech. I mean, I have a copy because it's a signed copy, because of the folks and the kind folks at Book Culture, who look after us. You know, they're very nice. They co-hosted with Harper's a Sanders talk at Riverside Church. It was on the anniversary of the King speech, the anti-Vietnam King speech at Riverside Church, and it, it was basically selling the book, and I was thinking the same kind of thing. Standing in line, I was approached several times by some Columbia students, other young folks who were representing other kinds of organizations in the spirit that you were just describing, Amna. And the audience itself in Riverside Church was sort of depressingly white, more, broadly speaking. So it did seem that it hadn't, this speech more than book, hadn't had, because clearly that was chosen as a symbolic site to do that, at least in this neighborhood. So I would just kind of translate what you're asking into this, like, an effect. It's not so much what it says, but what it does, and it can be evaluated in that sense. And one of the things that you just described, very well, it has done, or the Sanders phenomenon has done, is to bring a lot of people into the political process, for better or worse, differently. But anyway, and a lot of those folks were there, and there were questions, and the same sort of students.
And I suppose the only other thing, maybe the only other, in relation to what you were just saying, Reinhold, is that I suppose this is the functional equivalent of stump speeches.
Yeah, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not so much. So maybe the question here is not so much about this book as text, but the text being the stump speeches, which he does pronounce, right? In other words, so I mean, what we're analyzing, in a sense, in this seminar, are his stump speeches, right? Rather than thinking necessarily about the book as a text. Okay, Brandon, you've got some thoughts?
Yeah. So let me just say three things. So one is that, you know, linking this immigration question, this national security question, again, I do think it raises the critique you posed at the beginning about narrative. And so I think that part of the problem with, you know, the book, the speeches, the phenomena, is that because and I like the way you put it, I mean, because he's got a certain kind of vision of, you know, America at its greatest, what we want to somehow distill, that he almost starts in the 1950s in lots of ways and then goes from there, instead of trying to track a much broader terrain of American history that I actually think, not just because I like American history, but I think would help make his political arguments have more bite and have people understand that he's got a better sense of the kind of dynamics he's up against. So, you know, I tried to talk about the race question with, you know, I think you got to understand Reconstruction to understand the dynamics of race in this country. But these things about immigration, so why is it that he doesn't have a coherent immigration policy? Why is it that the nationalist presuppositions bedevil his immigration at every turn? In part, I mean, he doesn't even have a conception of the United States as uniquely responsible for some of the displacement around the world. So you could have a nationalist, essentially nationalist immigration policy that just is about your own nation's guilt and responsibility for certain types of migration crises, right? It's like, this is a thing we did, and because we're great, we're going to live up to our obligations to these particular people, a restorative justice approach to immigration. That would be coherent, that he could fold back in, but because he's not really enmeshed in a broad enough narrative of American history, but he's still got to deal with the idiosyncrasies of democratic politics, he just shoves the immigration thing into an anti-racist civil rights frame, and it can't go anywhere. It just seems to float there. It's not convincing to people, and doesn't seem analytically attached to his broader vision. So that's the first point. The second point, I do also kind of want to defend the text a bit on two regards. So the first, and this is my second point, is that I do think he's trying to, that he does make he takes a stance, it's performative in this way, takes a stance that elections are important. And we can't have this conversation. I know you've had a lot of other texts in this series that make other kinds of claims. And it's an important debate to have, because there are a lot of people on the left, a lot of people in the movement for Black Lives that I'm familiar with, who think elections aren't important, or think elections are a distraction, they're a waste of time, you know, that they only end up enfolding you back into the system of domination in some pernicious way that would be so objectionable that it's a decisive reason not to do it. I think that's a dangerous argument. You know, I think that's a dangerous argument. I think that the defense of the electoral project, the defense of, you know, the Du Bois quote I brought up, it's in part about racism, but it's in part, there's a line where he says, all civilized methods, right? So it is a defense also of democratic practice. And to think a lot about democracy as a way of achieving these ends, you know, that performatively the text is about that. And so the last thing I'll say, and a thing that, you know, again, I'd be curious as to what the rest of you think about it, but I see the Sanders phenomena as in part being about this question of hope versus cynicism. So there is a way in which the Trump phenomena to me is basically at its core about cynicism. But even the Clintonian triangulation strategy has a cynical aspect to it, where it's about, everything's about strategic, operating, we know this is enough of our constituency that we'll sacrifice them on particular issues so that we can gain more power and simply ameliorate their condition, not actually dramatically change it. For those of us who lived through the Clinton phenomenon, I remember these things. I remember Clinton taking the photo with the chain gang. I remember him flying back to Arkansas to execute a mentally ill black man so that he wouldn't look soft on crime, right? That kind of cynicism is met here, I think, with a certain kind of a constancy in Cornell's phrase, which he takes from Jane Austen. It's about constancy. It's about having principles that say, well, look, I could be the president if I were willing to sacrifice some other things and be more cynical about it, but I'd rather not be the president. I'd rather, be the mayor of Burlington, Vermont for 20 years than have a higher office if it meant sacrificing these principles. And I think in our particular cultural context, where that cynicism has seeped into everything, I don't know how you turn it around without these performative demonstrations that there are people who are different than that. There are people who operate under different kind of constraints. Now, again, from our perch of critical theory, we can blanket the world in a hermeneutics of suspicion and call even those things into question and talk about the libidinal dimension and the lust for fame and all of these kinds of things that might come along with it. Those are things we could do, but I think it brings me back to the anecdote you told at the beginning, is that they leave people more depressed than hopeful. They leave people less willing to sacrifice than to lay their lives on the line for something amazing. Like for me, as a civil rights historian, to read constantly about people who are willing to die to vote in 1960s Alabama and think that they can change the world by voting. And we have people who have, so much more liberty in certain respects and can't see any way out of it. I get why they come to those conclusions, but I think this is the movement's a powerful rejoinder to that, and how close it came is a powerful rejoinder to that.
Thanks. Before I move on to Adam, one question specifically on that question of hope and cynicism and coming out of the academic conference feeling so depressed that you're not doing anything is this is a hard series of graphs and graphic representations, It's interesting that, of course, the Sanders effect was very mobilizing in 2015-16. I think it was. It's possible that had there not been kind of, political shenanigans, it might even have been more successful. But, it did generate and mobilize a lot. There's some question as to whether or not it is generating or mobilizing now. And there's a lot of concern with the upcoming midterms that it's not fulfilling that function and that people aren't being mobilized. And as I was reading the book, I was wondering the extent to which that kind of whether the litany of these injustices and graphs and shifts over time and a number of faces that have shifted and in these face graph representation of CEO compensation and whatnot, could have an effect of just making people feel like, there's nothing to do. We're never gonna solve this. You know what I mean? In a way in which, the activists were accusing academics. I wonder sometimes as I was getting further and further in the book, I was wondering, boy, does this just make people feel like there's no way out, that there's such a great injustice? And I'm not sure. That's something. Yeah, go
one
ahead.
really quick point is that I do think that in political rhetoric, which often is a shadow of academic argument, that these things can feel like kind of mystical forces out there, right? So, you know, you rail against capitalism or racial capitalism or white supremacy. And it's hard to figure out, well, where do I fight that, right? And so again, I mean, I think this book, one of the interesting things about it is, you know, for someone who, you know, cares a lot about economic inequality, I mean, it is jarring to see here is this corporation with this particular CEO who is a person who they've evaded this amount of taxes,
Right.
and here is a plan that would attempt to solve that dilemma, right? It's not a mystical thing. These are people. These are people just like your people. They can be defeated with the right kind of approach. Now, there's a question of whether this is the right kind of approach, but to have it distilled for people in that way, right? For me, one of the best articles of the past couple years was Walter Johnson's piece on Ferguson, right? So he goes into Ferguson, and there are lots of commentary on Ferguson and white supremacy and the carceral state and things. He goes into Ferguson and he says, well, let's look at Ferguson, which is the home of a Fortune 500 company. Many of us don't know that. It's the home of a Fortune 500 company, a power company that pays nothing in taxes.
That's subsidized. That's basically subsidized. Right.
From a municipality whose high school lost accreditation. A American public high school. Do you know how bad your high school's got to be to lose accreditation? That's where Mike Brown went to high school. They were already trying to kill him before Darren Walker got on the scene, right? And it's a particular company that is doing these things that's part of a structure, and we've got to understand the patterns. But if we're going to scaffold up into these broader movements, being able to identify in some degree who the enemies are, I think is useful.
Right. Yeah. No, that was a brilliant article, showing also that the second largest source of revenue were the criminal fines for the municipality. Right.
And that's connected.
Right. Yeah. That was just powerful. Adam, do you want to jump in? Some of these questions, the military, we got the Frankfurt School.
On the DSA point, the numbers are quite phenomenal, actually. They went from 10,000 members to 60,000 this fall. So large was the increase that The Economist had a piece about it. So it's not just the Trump's Council of Economic Advisors, but The Economist that is seriously concerned about this. That seems to me a radical transformation, and I wouldn't want my comments to be read really as a disqualification of the book. I take Reinhold's point absolutely. I mean, you know, I moonlight as a historian anyway. That's my habit of reading these kind of texts. It's clearly built for purpose, and I would recommend it to people to read. I think people should read it. It's well written. It follows along. Every time you expect it to do the next move, it kind of does the next move. I think it's a platform that I would happily vote for, even more happily if it wasn't associated with him personally. But because he's the wrong person. In modern America, we don't need another 70-year-old dude. Like, we clearly don't. So I actually think it's a powerful text. But I mean, Brandon's comments are so on point. So I hesitate to do this, but I mean, like, I'm tempted to say, okay, so clearly there are the pitfalls of cynicism, but then you know the David Runciman argument. The flip side of that is hypocrisy, right? And if we have to choose, I would take hypocrisy any day of the week on exactly the grounds that you've outlined. But I think then the question is, as it were, exactly what are we buying into in this account to generate the resistance against cynicism that I think is crucial. In that constancy, you know, what is the price of that constancy? And the price is not just, I think, as you described it, the question of, you know, how much power you can attain, but also, as it were, what do you have to shut your eyes to? What do you have to lie to yourself about? And that, I think, brings us to the question that we had from the person online. It's like one of the things that this book is opaque about is conflict, actually. It's conflict. It's a little unclear about conflict. It names, as it were, bad guys. They are guys. I mean, it names a bunch of bad guys. It doesn't name the right bad guys. That's, as I said, that seems significant. And then it doesn't kind of really tell you what happens next, other than to say there'll be a fight and it'll be difficult because they've got power. But I think you're just being asked to vote. And that goes back to this issue of electoralism, that in the sense that it doesn't really spot, that was for me the significance of the not spelling out of a sociology or a social mechanics, is it does just leave you then with the magical, ultimately liberal instrument of exercising your voice, which people emphatically should do. And your references to the history of the civil rights struggle are extraordinarily powerful. But that is the limit of it then at that point. And now that's not fair to Sanders because he's clearly a pro-union guy, but there's no agenda here explicitly spelling out how you articulate the different levels, except in the little gobbets, the little kind of guides to the reader at the end of each section, which are a helpful list of suggestions of organizations and movements you might join. But I sort of share the sense of the person online that there's a lack of clarity about what this struggle would involve, and ultimately a reduction, therefore, to the electoral sphere, which is fine in its own terms, but may be limiting, and we know how limiting. I mean, we just did quite recently have an experiment with an administration that was welcomed at a moment of total delegitimization of the existing order of things, and we know how limited the results were of that process. When he says he wants to redo Dodd-Frank, I just simply ask, how? With what means? You sure you'll get a better outcome if you open that can of worms? Like, why would we believe that? What would convince you that the extraordinary power of high pressure, big money law would not overwhelm any effort that you might undertake? This goes back to your point. We would need to change the process of legislation in Congress to have any confidence at all that reopening Dodd-Frank would get us to a better place than we're currently at. And there's none of that mechanics is spelled out. And I don't think it's simply because it's a stump speech, because you can make a pretty funny stump speech out of Dodd-Frank if you want to. I mean, it's a Kafkaesque nightmare of modern government. So I think
it started as 2 pages, right? Originally.
Yes.
The original draft was 2 pages. It ended up being something like 300 pages.
And the crucial thing is that, like we were talking about yesterday with Michel Ferrer,
right,
that is time and temporality. And this is maybe an interesting element of constancy. On the other hand, if constancy is orientated towards the periodic electoral mobilization, is that really the struggle that we need? Because the thing about Dodd-Frank is that the lobbyists pull back to a degree in the passage of the actual legislation and then swarm all over the implementation of the regulations and swarm all over the explanation of the rules that have been passed. And that's where the real work of power is done, because those businesses will pay for top-class lawyers round the clock, all year long, every day of the week, 24 hours a day. Right. And against that kind of power, what is the mobilizing alternative here? That, I think, for me, is just the open question. Does this book do any harm? I'm sure it does the opposite. It's it's well-intentioned. It represents a genuine movement in the United States at this moment.
But it does very much have that kind of senatorial platform element to it, right? I mean, the proposals, these are in some sense the simplicity of some of the proposals, precisely, right? Just as you were suggesting, the simplicity of some of the proposals are very typical congressional simple proposals that ignore or kind of blink the reality that all of the work is going to be done in the regulatory frameworks that that involve implementation and that go awry, right? Okay, let's get some more comments. Jeffrey? Is it working?
Is this working? Yeah. So I was also wondering that this sort of stems from Brandon's comments about voting, and I guess Adam as well, about it seems to me that Sanders is kind of recovering and affirming a certain vision of citizenship, and whether that's a good thing. You know, it's sort of tethered to a national image. It's tethered to, it actually really reminded me, like when Adam was talking about Sanders' vision for what Americans are going to do with all of their free time. It kind of reminds me of a speech that Louis Brandeis gave in 1906 called Hours of Labor, where he's talking about the reason why citizens have to have time off from work is not so that they can become lazy and while away the hours. It's so that they can do the work of citizenship, and that is sort of the premise on which his larger ideas of character building and being sort of like an active member of an American society are about. And it seems like Sanders really sort of buys into that sort of New Deal progressive vision, capital P, progressive vision of citizenship. Is that the right vision for now? Does it sort of accommodate all of the concerns that we have about war, about immigration, et cetera?
Okay. Yeah, good. I've got Diana, but I mean, that really does tie into the way in which it does have this kind of mid-20th century feel to it, right? Okay, Diana. Yeah.
Okay. So I think I just want to go back to the what is it that we are supposed to do question, that it's the part of like the ongoing question throughout this seminar. And the reason why I want to go back to it is because as I hear you, I think about how you have touched some of the crucial points that we have come out throughout the sessions. For example, this idea of the hope versus cynicism being one of the original points of why I believe this seminar is asking what is it that critical theory is proposing what to do at this moment, is because after feeling that critical theory was unveiling and unveiling and unveiling, but at the end leaving an emptiness on what was the action to do, that question needed to be posed. And throughout our classes, we have had certain answers. One of them is, well, doing critique is an action itself, so that's the praxis of critique. Another answer was, well, maybe critical theory can propose new utopias, but then you would have to engage into a project that will, of course, be getting blinded by certain stuff, because every political project will necessarily make some compromises under things that are not necessarily always critical. And then I believe lately we have reached to this relationship between critical theory and social movements, which I believe is one of the most refreshing approaches to it. And I believe it is mainly the feminist movement and the civil rights movement, the ones that are bringing much richness out of that conversation. Last class, a proposal under that was becoming ungovernable, withdrawing from institutions, an answer to what a way of critical practice and thought would do. We had at the beginning one proposal that was critical theory must become conservative, to which many of us reacted in pain. And now I feel we are talking about, as I hear you speak, one of the things I feel you're speaking about is about the relationship in critical thought and critical praxis is about maybe the critical academia, because that's what it is, I believe so, supporting social movements. So getting it out of this space, reforming the way we do critical thought so that we can get it more into the social movement, enriching in that conversation. Another thing that I believe Amna has explored is the idea of trying to do an emancipatory use of institutions, of law particularly, if that is possible in any way. So I would like just to go back to the question of what does critical praxis mean? Is that possible? Without the burning, maybe, in this book. And the last thing I just wanted to say is just a side comment on, I do agree with you on how the text leaves behind certain populations. It does mention race, it does mention gender, but in a very superficial way. But I believe one of the reasons why that might be, of course, not raising certain polemics, but one of the potentials of it is crazily join people under a material agenda. This is a discussion that we have been having with certain colleagues. Like, remember, we can go all under having a livable wage, whether you are a woman or whether you are in the disability movement or whether you are a migrant. And I believe it has that sort of sense, a sense of recognizing that is there in some way, but also trying to join identity politics agendas. Or maybe I just want to read that out of the text.
Okay, thank you, Diana. Hold on, we've got another question.
Thank you. There is a lot to say, I think, tonight, about the book, but about the discussion we had tonight too. We could talk about body-worn cameras and the way it's addressed without criticism or with a lack of criticism in that book, at least. We could talk about the necessity to still try, even if there is no hope. I feel hopeless. I still think I have to try. But I have a question for you, and it's something that really I've been turning in my head for a long time. And it's, for me, this book, as well as the movement in America, and I'll say to a certain extent in France, from which I am, is not in any capacity today talking about internationalism. There is no more worldwide revolution going on. And I think, personally, that's a huge problem. And I think that's also not only a problem, but the reason why nothing would happen. We talked about many people tonight, and I think we also need to talk about Malcolm X when we talk about this book. What was capital at the end of his life for him was, if I'm not mistaken, you will know that better than me, it was the worldwide revolution. And I think we don't talk about it anymore today, and there is not even a space to talk about it today. The moment you talk about that, you're idealist or you're aiming for something that is too far out of reach. At least that's my opinion. And it has been turning in my head, and I would like your opinion on that. Yeah, it doesn't talk about, it talks as an American in America, and so it talks about a revolution that we think is a bit, or we think is not a revolution looking from Europe, but also it doesn't talk about a revolution as a global thing.
I have two quick questions. One would be this idea of hope.
This idea of
Hope. Hope, yes. Obama came to power. His campaign was, on the premise of hope. Bernie Sanders' campaign is on the premise of hope. The actual policy formulations look quite different. So, I mean, when we talk about hope as, in some sense, a driving, can you hear me?
No, yeah, I
Okay.
think so.
Can you hear me now?
That's much better.
Okay, so I'll just start again. I'm saying that Obama's campaign was on the premise of hope. Bernie Sanders' campaign was on the premise of hope. The actual policy formulations look quite different. So what do we think about these changing goalposts of hope? The fact is that it's only hope. It's not our sense of hope, whether attached to Obama or whether attached to Bernie Sanders, isn't really linked to a certain idea of where we want, America to be. And is that the fundamental weakness? That is that we are attaching hope to a wide and widely ranging, scheme of policies without actually having very concrete ideas about where we want the country to go, the direction in which we want the country to go. And that is our fundamental weakness, because the right seems to have a very strong and solid idea of where they want the country to go. We just have hope. I'm also using the word we quite lightly because I'm not American, I'm Indian. And I just want to echo your concerns about this absolute lack of internationalism in not just Bernie Sanders, but just almost any aspect of the American left that I've encountered. I've had Trotskyists tell me that the revolution will start only if it starts in America. Yeah. And frankly, that idea is absurd, right? Like it's such an imperialist idea of revolution that if it doesn't happen here, it doesn't happen anywhere. And is that, in some sense, the fatal flaw of the American left, which is that it can't imagine itself outside of America?
Thank you, Darshana. Reinhold, you want to jump in? So
yeah, I don't want to.
From you, and then we'll go back to our panel.
Okay. I hate to, because it's such a great question. No, to the points that Diana, you were making, it occurred to me just a kind of tactical suggestion when considering these things, at least is the way that I like to think about it, maybe it's useful, is whether something is articulated in such a manifesto, or if we can call it that, or I think policy platform basically, or not. There are embedded in these texts, including even, I would say, the text from the economic advisors, universal questions. And this is something that the academic left has had a hard time saying even, because we're so particularist. But universal questions that can only be articulated and made sense of in a situated fashion. In a shorthand, the one that to me is striking from the very traditional socialist perspective, strikingly missing and has been missing in the Sanders style kind of conversation, never mind anything else less left-leaning, is the housing question. This is predictable with me. But the housing question, because it is in some sense so difficult and so vexed in this country in particular, but we can speak about India. It would be Modi basically came to power on the real estate industry and the kind of rent extracting mechanisms of megacities. But so that's the one. That's one that's not there. It's the one that's not in the laundry list. It's interestingly missing, given the fact that we're governed by a real estate developer. So the one that is there, that you mentioned some at the beginning, but I think we could say much more about, that is in a sense much more intuitively universal, is the climate question. Actually, the climate question, you mentioned, Adam, but because really this is sort of pablum. I mean, what he's saying about climate is just, it's of course all true, but this is barely scratches the surface of a serious, critical conversation about the if you read the IPCC report, the tens of millions of lives, almost none of whom would be white, that are basically scheduled to die, to be lost under current conditions. So it's really kind of biopolitically life and death, and at a planetary scale. It puts all of this kind of parochial nationalism in the shade. So anyway, it's a kind of thought in response to this. Obviously, there are many more. Inequality, nobody ever says equality. Inequality is okay, 1%, 99%, but equality, the mathematics of it, and in a sense the politics of it are unthinkable. So, that's one way to be specific, at least.
Any final thoughts before we go back to our speakers?
I just want to briefly point something out. So something that the benefit of running the lectures social media room granted me. The audience of Bernie Sanders' book is not critical theorists. It's not people who are adults. It's teenagers. Right. It's a young adult book. Absolutely. And I think it needs to be read in that context. And the humongous questions of climate change, of income inequality, of reforming the carceral state are not going to be addressed in the span of, what, a 200-page book with a lot of pictures. But it might drive the people who will be deciding these questions in the next decade and the decade after that to vote. And I just wanted to leave with this one factoid, this other thing that I was able to look up while sitting here. In the 2016 election, turnout amongst all age groups declined except for one. It was voters 18 to 29 years old who increased their turnout over Obama's second term by 1.1%. Now that's really modest, but I think that that is something. And whether or not Bernie Sanders had an effect on that, well, the book certainly didn't because it came out in 2017. But I think that its value to our democracy and to this conversation, I think, needs to be read in that context.
Yeah, and that is a burning question right now, with the midterms looming, as to whether or not there's going to be a continued effect. I mean, because most of the pollsters are very concerned about the fact that there isn't, that the real soft electorate is the young people right now, but the question is, why is that, and how does it relate to these particular interventions, right? To Sanders and to Indivisible, or why isn't it that Sanders right now is having an effect on the younger voters? All right, I think let's go back to our panelists then, and so there are a lot of great questions on the table, especially we want to address the internationalism questions and the hope, and what is critical praxis, the question of the New Deal. So, Adam, why don't you address some of those issues, as many as you can, and also wrap up, and then each one of you will address and wrap.
Excellent. I'm particularly intrigued by this question about the global dimension and the internationalism question. You could feel, presumably, the sympathy in my comments with your position. I had to review a book by Robert Kuttner, who's a inoffensive member of the American left, for Dissent recently, which culminated precisely in that claim that if there's going to be a progressive development anywhere in the world, it has to start in the United States. It's founded, in his case, interestingly, and I think this is really the rub, on a quite acute analysis of power. In other words, it starts from the premise that America is the center of whether it's financial or military power, and then it draws its conclusions from there. In his case, it's also coupled with the classic combination of mid-century nostalgia, the idea that the New Deal, the Marshall Plan, the Roosevelt-Truman moment was, as it were, this sort of extraordinary cosmic alignment of progressive forces that enabled the victory of the right side in World War II, and so on and so forth. So this is deeply wired into the American left of a certain sort, and it is based in at least that kind of realistic analysis of power and how it operates. And of course, it begs the question then of how we escape the extraordinary flatness which generates the conclusion that it must obviously start in the Bay Area or on the East Coast or something. And that, I think, is when it gets interesting. Like, so then presumably one has to draw on, take your pick, some kind of Trotskyite legacy, uneven and combined development, something like that, to begin to think the spatial logics of power that might enable progressive politics in other parts of the world to gain a foothold, to mobilize themselves against what could be devastating American interventions or neglect when it comes to the issue of climate change, how you gain purchase. And it seems to me, in our current configuration, if you look at, say, fields like trade policy, this isn't a dimension of progressive politics, but it's a dimension in which people are actually trying to conduct policy in the face of the exhaustion of a globalist paradigm which has just run into the sand with the WTO. The answer is regionalism. And that seems to be everywhere, the solution. Certainly thinking from a European point of view, that is, of course, the problem of Europe, how you actually articulate politics within that region. But that seems to me to be the opportunity of the American left just begs over and over again, is like, why is there not a more constructive, affirmative, positive politics? Not of this endless negotiation of the migrant problem, but of an embrace of America's situation in North America, including Canada and all its complexity, and Mexico and all its complexity, and Central America as its neighbor. This seems to me to be why is the American left not systematically bilingual? just as an opening move? Why does it not insist on bilingualism as an essential precondition for a realistic politics in the moment? That would seem to me to be almost as urgent a question as the question of formulating a left foreign policy, which is hugely on the agenda right now. Everyone right now is trying to write the missing chapters of that, but there are think tank exercises afoot to generate that. But it seems to me that this is a more urgent and more direct question of, like, what does America do with this possibility? And it's I think negligent that there is not more mobilization around that issue, because they are entangled, fatefully entangled, and will be over coming generations. So I think that's to me, the analytic goes, okay, find power. That does imply a kind of centricity. Then the question is how you work your way out of that intellectually and politically. The question then is where the other locuses are. And the regions can't be conceived of narrowly or simplistically or conventionally. Clearly for Europe, it has at this point to include a conversation about the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Otherwise, progressive politics is just opening the door endlessly to exploitation from the right. If there are no constructive answers on that question, there is no future for European progressive politics. And I think similarly in the United States, if there is not an embrace of this problem of the border regions and bilingualism, it's a sort of shattering failure to exploit a huge opportunity.
Thank you, Adam. Brandon, do you want to?
This is making me remember one interesting moment of the Sanders campaign, which is, I don't know if you guys remember, but Hillary Clinton was boasting about her close relationship with Henry Kissinger. And Sanders had staged at the debate. He says, I don't know who I'm taking foreign policy advice from, but it's definitely not Henry Kissinger. And what was interesting about him, it was like it was an isolated thing, but to me, that kernel speaks to, okay, this is a guy who's been on the left for a very long time, and he's got his origins in the anti-war struggle. Is aware about the American imperialism, at least in Vietnam, and again to try to tell a story about America that for me is about tragedy. It's about when King writes about Vietnam, he says, like, here's a country that's birthed in a certain kind of promise that has continuously failed that promise. And it's failed it not just at home with the racial question or gender questions. It's failed it abroad, that even when people seek egalitarian alliances or emancipatory shared projects, we do the opposite, right? We embrace exploitation, we embrace cynicism, we embrace murder and destruction in a lot of these instances. And so you have to understand that the American public doesn't learn this stuff in school. We don't learn that this country occupied Haiti, right? What high school do they teach that in the United States, right? So you're dealing with like a kind of, it's not even. But you got a really fundamental ignorance here, right? We can't be afraid of that word, ignorance, about the history of this country. And one way of scaffolding these transnational claims would be about situating America back in the world narratively so that we can imagine, right? It's not, people don't just immigrate randomly, right? There's a reason, there's a cyclical pattern to immigration that's in part about where we have been, right? But we don't have those conversations, and we certainly don't have them on the public stage of the election. The second piece I just wanted to say briefly about the kind of race and identity politics and class question. Part of what I was trying to get at in my remarks is that there's a normal way of framing the question that Sanders is trying to do a class-based universalism, and then there are people who are raising identity politics objections against him, and that's making impossible the class-based universalism, which would be the real emancipatory thing, or it's undermining the independent significance of these various struggles and thus diminishing them. I think those are misguided ways of framing the question. And, you know, part of what my remarks were getting at is that internal to Sanders' own logic, right, there's a way of talking about racial injustice that tracks alongside these class inequalities, this economic domination, that would only bolster the case that he's trying to make about where power lies in the United States and the kind of coalition that you need to generate it, and the significance of the participation of poor people, people of color in that coalition. That you're telling a comprehensive story about why American elites have tended to oppress or repress those groups, right? It's not just a kind of diffuse stigma. It's about political power and about what they think are the consequences of empowering these groups economically. So to me, again, it's a kind of missed opportunity to enrich the story he's already trying to tell and hold at bay the more cynical, opportunistic versions of identity politics that I do think really cause his campaign a lot of trouble, and are part of the reason you've got these sort of free-floating claims in this book about, oh yeah, I also care about these things too. And then the last thing I'll say just about hope. You know, I think like most virtue talk, it can come unmoored from any particular project, right? We can be courageous in a number of realms. We can be compassionate in a number of realms. So it's always going to have that danger to it. And Obama, I think, really exploited the rhetoric of hope in a way that was ultimately not as productive for the kind of politics that I support. Now, I don't think that means that we can abandon it, because it's one of the central categories of action, right? If, you know, I come from, you know, I was born in Baltimore. I come from, you know, a community and a family where people are really in despair and cannot imagine a scenario in which any political action they take that they would self-describe as political. I mean, we might layer on our critical theory and think that the drugs they were selling are political in some fashion, but that would be a different way of running it. A way that they would even self-describe or self-identify as political, they can't imagine that has any productivity, or that there is any place for them in a movement to change this country, that they are actually in any way co-creators of the society. Now, part of that is reasonable analysis. There are a lot of obstacles to that. So the question is, if there are seams with which we see through critique and reconstruction possibilities for actually changing the world as it is, I think it's our duty to try to exhort, inspire, and let people know that there are seams of action and that their dignity, self-respect, and flourishing is really at stake. And it's not something that has to happen behind their back or around them. It's something that could be a part of. And to me, that's really what hope is about. It's hope as a kind of virtue embedded in action in its last instance. It's not an epistemic thing. It's about acting and being a hope. It's about generating those possibilities out of an intuition, or even at the very least, a humility that we know in advance all the possible outcomes.
Thank you, Brandon. Amna?
Very briefly on the internationalism question, I mean, I think that seems right on. I do think in my experience in people of color left spaces, there's a little bit more conversation about it. And I also agree with you tacitly that, you know, the revolution, if it comes, will probably start elsewhere, right? And I think the U.S. government thinks that too, which is why we have all these military bases around the world, which kind of brings us back full circle. On the question of praxis, this is a question that's near and dear to my heart, partly because I think in some ways, I know that this is a little unfair, but I think in some ways the answer is fairly simple, partly because we do have movements and party organizations right now that are gaining currency and swelling in size and having some influence. Now, I know there's a long, long, long way to go, but I think we should be joining mass movements and party organizations. And I should have probably, kind of put a little bit more framing on the vignettes I shared. I have been left-oriented and critical for probably, I grew up in a pretty critical family, so I kind of have had my political orientation since I was pretty young. And I have been thinking and studying race and inequality and law, for the duration of my career. But for me, and I have been doing different kinds of political work for that time too, but for me, after Mike Brown was killed and the rebellion happened, a riot happened in Ferguson, and all of this kind of movement activity started happening all over the country, and I started to try to get involved, and then was involved in different local, state, and national movement spaces. It has been deeply transformative to me. I haven't written on national security actually since then, because I've started to write about these movements and what they're doing and kind of the history and the intellectual traditions they're kind of tapping into and thinking about, and how they challenge, at least in the kind of institutions I'm in, which are law schools, deeply contradict everything in some sense that most of us teach. And so for me, there's been a selfish element to it too, because for me, in these left movement party spaces, the conversation has been so much more dynamic, difficult, interesting, provocative than the vast majority of academic spaces that I've been in, that is a big selfish reason also that I keep coming back. But part of it as well is that in that space and in that kind of collective, there is kind of, I have all the cynical tendencies as well, but it's tapped into this sense of hope and optimism, because partly in those spaces, at least when they've been the most alive and the most dynamic, there is a sense of changed possibility, not just in terms of vision, but in the way that we relate to each other and the kind of demands that we can make on each other, and that we can make on the state, and how we want to change things. And so when I supported the Sanders book, it's not because I support a narrow vision of electoral politics, or I think that we all need to, no, not at all, but it's more the project of mass mobilization, of getting people to engage differently, because I think if people kind of, come together, like for example, DSA, I don't think DSA is all, I'm not involved in DSA, maybe now that I'm here in New York for this year, I'll check it out, but, I don't think DSA is all organized around electoral politics, at least to the little murmurings I hear from friends who are involved. They're enlarged in a much bigger gambit here that I think is really important and deeply, could possibly be pretty transformative. And so for me, it's about joining mass movements and party organizations, and I think that would have implications for critical theory. Certainly the ascendance of these movements have made it possible for me, for example, to say very different things than I was saying before these movements came up. And so in that sense, of course, movements and academics and critical theory are always in deep conversation. And for some people, being able to say those things or saying those things or reconstituting the narratives, is really important praxis that needs to be done. But for me, I'm interested also in that kind of selfish experience and kind of the transformative, physical, collective community experience that I can't get out of academic institutions, and at least now. And so for me, joining the organizations and doing that kind of collective work, is really where I think it's at.
All right, thank you, Amna. And Brandon and Adam. That was a very inspiring closure to the seminar, and the seminar did live up to all of my expectations. So I'm really thrilled by that. There is this central looming question in critical theory as to whether the space of critical theory has kind of narrowed and become limited to academia, and how it can kind of reach out again. And I think that this conversation we had today was really important to thinking about that, right? How it's possible to extend critical thought back out into these spaces of social movements, learning from it perhaps, and that's what you were suggesting, right? The movement here would be the praxis, the social movement praxis, actually then informing our thought more than any other direction, which is very promising, I think. All right, so Before I ask you to join me in thanking our extraordinary panel, just wanted to remind you that we'll be meeting next for Praxis 413 on November 14th, and we'll be reading a very different set of texts. We're turning to alt-right writings next. And I thought that it was important for a couple of reasons. First, because those writings are extraordinarily strategic, and there is in their remarkable efforts at kind of indicating exactly what needs to be done, how it should be done, how to the point of kind of managing your own discourse as someone on the alt-right, et cetera. So there's a real technical, tactical, strategic knowledge there that I think is really important to read and think about, however difficult it may be to get through some of the texts because of some of the blatant misogyny and racism of some of these texts. The second reason is that there's also been this strange, uncomfortable nexus between the alt-right and critical theory, as you know. Many of the chief thinkers on the alt-right have actually been trained in critical theory. Richard Spencer wrote his master's on Theodore Adorno at the University of Chicago. And Steve Bannon has often spoken about the way in which kind of there is a pickup of critical theory. Former student at the University of Chicago who works for Steve Bannon, Julia Ahn, wrote her senior thesis on Leo Bersani at the University of Chicago. So, I mean, there's also this other dimension to it, which is worth investigating and thinking
more like
about.
Chicago.
Well, I spent 10 years there, so yeah, okay. But in any event, so that's where we're headed next, November 14th. If you're interested, the readings we're going to be sending them by email. So do email Guylaine, and she will send you the readings as PDFs. But and before, again, I also want to thank Guylaine for organizing this seminar and for all the work that she does. And with that, thank you, Amna, thank you, Brandon, thank you, Adam, for a terrific conversation.